Welcome back to another episode on Stolen from Her Bed, a victimization analysis of Elizabeth Smart. In this episode, listeners will learn how victimization operates through the lens of the 2002 abduction of Elizabeth Smart. Rather than retelling a true crime story, this analysis applies routine activity theory and the concept of the ideal victim framework to examine why this victim and this setting were targeted, how harm extended beyond the crime itself, and how institutional responses can both protect and further harm victims. Now just imagine this for a second. You wake up in the middle of the night to a random man standing over you with a knife at your neck, whispering to you, "I have a knife at your neck. Do not make a sound. Get up and come with me." That is what Elizabeth Smart dealt with, and that was just the beginning of a traumatizing 9 months for her. Well, let's start with the basic facts. Who was Elizabeth Smart and what exactly happened to her? Well, on June 5th of 2002, Elizabeth Smart was taken from her own bedroom at knife point by a man named Brian David Mitchell. Brian David Mitchell was not a random person. He was not someone the Smarts didn't know, just a random person. He had been working on the Smart house for quite some time. Elizabeth's father offered him some money if he had come and worked on the house. Now, this actually helped Mitchell a lot, trying to get into the house. He knew his way in, and he knew his way around the house. He had been stalking Elizabeth for months, and planning this. At around 3 in the morning, Elizabeth woke up to a strange man hovering over her. He whispered into her ear and said, "I have a knife at your neck. Don't make a sound. Get up and come with me." Elizabeth was full of shock. She had no idea what to do, so she did exactly what the man said. Next to her was sleeping Mary Catherine, her little sister at the time. Mary was full of shock, and she did not move, she didn't make a sound, and she pretended to be asleep. Mitchell then took Elizabeth out of her own home, and they hiked 3.5 miles up the mountains of Salt Lake City. They finally got to the campsite, and there waiting was a woman outside of the tent. Her name was Wanda Barzee. Wanda was Mitchell's other wife. They had previously gotten married a few years back. Wanda Barzee took Elizabeth and told her she had to get undressed for her wedding ceremony. Elizabeth was full of shock. She didn't know what to do. So Elizabeth did what she had to, and on that very first night, Elizabeth was raped. This was just the beginning of many things that Elizabeth had to endure for the next 9 months. Not only was she sexually assaulted and sexually abused, she had threats against her family by Mitchell. She had a bunch of religious manipulation and extreme isolation from everybody. She was also forced to drink a bunch of alcohol, on the daily sometimes. Mitchell and Wanda would actually have her drink it to the point where she would throw it all up, and then she would have to perform sexual things with both of them. Now, Mitchell didn't exactly want to leave her and Wanda alone all the time, and he would have to make appearances in public. So he would take Elizabeth with them. But to be able to do that and to be able to disguise them and control them and to conceal Elizabeth's identity, she had to wear veils, long dresses, wigs, and sunglasses. These disguises were dictated by her captors. And this served two purposes, which was maintaining her control over the appearance and reducing the risk of recognition, while also psychologically reinforcing that she belonged to her captors, of course. Now, during this time, Elizabeth's case actually became nationally public. She's actually one of the most infamous cases in the entire world. This was thanks to her little sister, Mary Catherine. Mary Catherine went to her parents the night she was abducted and told them immediately. And that's when the search began. They had America's Most Wanted and media campaigns outside, and the case was featured on America's Most Wanted, giving its national exposure. National news programs broadcast her story repeatedly. And then the best part about this was that Mary Catherine was able to recognize who had taken her big sister. They had a person come in and draw the man that took Elizabeth. Thanks to Mary Catherine's amazing memory, everybody was in search for Brian David Mitchell, and they actually had a face to the name, Brian David Mitchell. She was then found on March 12th of 2003, only 18 miles from her home in Sandy, Utah. Both Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were later convicted and ultimately receiving 15 years in prison for Wanda, and Mitchell got a life sentence. But the story doesn't end with just facts. To truly understand Elizabeth's experience, we need to analyze why she became a target, how her victimization was maintained, and what harms she endured, both immediate and long-term. So let's start with the first framework, routine activity theory. You might ask, what does this theory even mean? That's a good question. Routine activity theory suggests that a crime occurs when three things come together. A motivated offender, which would be Mitchell in this case, a suitable target, Elizabeth Smart, and a lack of capable guardianship. So why Elizabeth? Why at the time and in the place? Well, Mitchell was a motivated offender. Elizabeth was a suitable target, a 14-year-old girl, physically small and vulnerable, and guardianship was low. It was nighttime, her parents were asleep, and Mitchell already knew the house and its routines. He knew it inside and out because he had been working on it. And a big specific example of this is that Mitchell had previously worked inside the Smart home. This gave him knowledge of the layout and reduced the family's ability to detect him. This perfectly illustrates how opportunity structures, knowing where and when a crime can occur and can increase risk. So now, what does this framework explain well? Well, it helps us understand why the abduction was possible. It also highlights the role of the access, familiarity, and timing. But what it doesn't explain well is a sexual assault and prolonged captivity occurred. It doesn't account for psychological manipulation, gendered power, and coercive control, which brings us to our second framework, sexual victimization and coercive control, which is a big theme on the Elizabeth Smart case. You're probably asking, what even is coercive control? So, simply put, it's a pattern of domination, including threats, sexual assault, isolation, and manipulation. This maintains control over a victim, mainly. In Elizabeth's case, it is Mitchell threatened to harm her family, forced religious practices, controlled her clothing, behavior, and repeatedly sexually assaulted her. Same goes with Wanda Barzee. She was as much the problem as Mitchell was. And you also might wonder, if she had the opportunity to escape, why didn't she? Well, actually, she did. And Mitchell chased after her and threatened her and said, if you ever escape again, I will kill your entire family. Now, this is where coercive control becomes important. Victims in these situations often stay compliant because of extreme fear, and that is how Elizabeth became more compliant and stayed by. They calculate survival risk, anticipate threats, and develop strategies to minimize harm. This is a survival response, and it isn't a sign of consent or weakness. This framework also reveals the ongoing dynamics of victimization just beyond a single incident, showing how coercive control can escalate risk and trauma over time. However, this also has its limits. It may not fully account for situational opportunity factors or for why some victims are able to resist or report while others do not. Let's dive into the harms and trauma impacts of after Elizabeth was rescued. So Elizabeth actually had a lot of psychological harm done and social harm. So to start with psychological harm, with the repeated sexual assault and prolonged captivity, it increased the risk for PTSD for Elizabeth, depression and anxiety. Elizabeth also described living in constant fear and complying to survive. In a 2023 media analysis with Gillian, found that a substantial portion of sexual assault survivors develop PTSD symptoms within the first year. This supports the expectation of long-term psychological impact in this case. The second harm is social. After Elizabeth was found, a lot of people thought that they would ask her, why didn't you run? Why didn't you get away from this? And this was really hard on Elizabeth because she couldn't explain to every single person who asked her that she literally could not due to Mitchell's coercive power and authority and his threats. Elizabeth also experienced permanent loss of privacy due to national media coverage, and she had to repeatedly recount her trauma publicly. And that level of exposure can intensify stress and complicate recovery. And so, moving on to secondary victimizations, there are two forms visible here. The first being credibility questioning. So basically, people asking, why did she not escape? Second, repeated public retelling and media exposure, which was really hard on Elizabeth at first because she just wanted to be her normal self. She wanted to go back to high school and she wanted to continue her life, but everybody saw her as a girl who got kidnapped, so that made it hard for her. Secondary victimization occurs when institutional or social responses unintentionally harm survivors through doubt, blame, or invasive processes. So what was the police's role in this? Well, law enforcement ultimately located Elizabeth alive and secured convictions. That reflects persistence and coordinations. However, high-profile cases create pressure, repeated interviews, and intense media attention, which can risk re-traumatization. Especially for Elizabeth. And then a trauma-informed improvement would include minimizing repeated questioning and ensuring immediate involvement of trained victim advocates, which actually Elizabeth herself is doing up until this day, which is amazing. And then on the other hand, we have the courts, where the courts actually ensured accountability through a life sentence of Brian David Mitchell. But the public testimony, long delays, and media presence can create a lot of stress. Trauma-informed courts would expand privacy protections and provide structured psychological preparation before testimony. Elizabeth Smart's own writing reinforces what research shows. Dworkin and his colleagues demonstrate that PTSD symptoms are common after sexual assault. Elizabeth's descriptions across her 2013 book of My Story, her 2018 book of Where There's Hope, and her 2022 books mirrored those trauma patterns: fear conditioning, shame, hypervigilance, and survival compliance. Laskostov and Boyle's 2025 study, which applies routine activity theory, found that the offender access and opportunity structures significantly influence victimization risk, which in the Elizabeth Smart case, Mitchell's prior employment at the Smart home by working on their house and their roof directly reflects this because it gave him an outline of where the house was, where the rooms were, and all of that. Routine activity theory also suggests that increasing capable guardianship reduces risks. Elizabeth's advocacy shows that guardianship is not only physical, it is cognitive. When youth understand grooming tactics, coercion, trauma responses, and self-worth, they gain internal guardianship. Her books do function as a lived experience, evidence supporting prevention education. And then, to sum it up, based on this analysis, I would highly recommend mandatory trauma-informed personally safety education in middle schools. So specifically talking about like annual instruction on grooming behaviors and coercive tactics, explicit discussion that assault does not define worth, anonymous reporting pathways in schools, and instruction delivered by trained professionals. This will strengthen capable guardianship by increasing awareness and early reporting. Youth vulnerable to grooming benefit most to ensure equity, funding most support under resource districts and alternative education settings. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Victimization Podcast. Today we explored the case of Elizabeth Smart, not just to recount what happened, but to understand a deeper dynamic of victimization. We examined how situational factors such as opportunity and exposure contributed to the risk and how patterns of sexual victimization and coercive control shape the victim's experience. We also discussed the full scope of harm, focusing on physical impacts such as health and PTSD, and also social impacts such as people looking at Elizabeth Smart and using her identity as saying that she was a girl kidnapped, and given that identity, that made her seem like she was more of a victim and not being able to live her usual normal life, which made it harder for her in the future when she got out of all of this and she went back to high school. It's also important to recognize the harm can continue even after the immediate incident. Victims often face secondary victimization when systems or social networks fail to provide support or when responses are dismissive and re-traumatizing. In this case, Elizabeth's social networks and community response played a huge role in either amplifying or mitigating the impact of the crime. By grounding this analysis in research, including studies on trauma and patterns of sexual victimization, we can see that victimization is rarely a single event. Instead, it unfolds over time, shaped by the offender's behavior and by the responses of institutions and communities. Understanding these dynamics is essential not only for supporting victims, but also for developing strategies to prevent future harm. Finally, this case underscores the importance of trauma-informed policies and practices. Systems like law enforcement, courts, and victim services each have a critical role in minimizing harm, supporting survivors, and promoting accountability. Evidence-based interventions, early support, and policies that prioritize safety and empowerment can make a meaningful difference. As listeners, I hope you take away a deeper understanding of how physical and social harms affect victims, the ways coercive control and sexual victimization operate, and in the importance of thoughtful, informed responses. By learning from cases like this, we can work toward a society where victims are supported, protected, and never left to face harm alone. Thank you.